Decolonization presented by Karina and Hannah. Here are our table of contents.
Introduction. In Canada, the process of opposing and rectifying colonization impacts on Indigenous peoples' lands, customs, languages, and rights is known as decolonization. It requires recognizing the injustices that Indigenous people have experienced throughout the history and the present and fighting to restore their well-being, independence, and dignity. Along with supporting Indigenous-led change activities, non-Indigenous people must critically assess their roles and responsibilities within the colonial system as part of decolonization. It is a long-term, multifaceted endeavor that calls for the cooperation and dedication of all Canadians. It is neither a one-time occurrence nor an easy fix. Exploring decolonization, what is it? Decolonization, once viewed as the formal process of handing over the instruments of government, is now recognized as a long-term process involving the bureaucratic, cultural, linguistic, and psychological divesting of colonial power. It restores Indigenous worldviews, restores culture and traditional ways, and replaces Western interpretations of history with Indigenous perspectives of history. An important part of bringing attention to the necessity of decolonization was the work of the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which was founded in reaction to the legacy of residential schools. Key measures toward reconciliation are outlined in the 94 calls to action of the TRC, which include modifications to the legal, medical, and education system. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is now an essential foundational document for Canada's decolonization initiatives. It highlights how crucial land rights, Indigenous self-determination, and cultural preservation are. This image shows the percentage of how many settlers in Canada actually know about the history. 66% is not a lot. This goes to show that there needs to be ways in which we educate society about where they are living and the ways that people used to be treated. Not only should they be taught about history, but about the present and how things haven't changed a whole lot for the Indigenous peoples of Canada. Recognizing historical injustices and addressing current issues requires an understanding of the realities of Indigenous children in Canada. The enduring effects of forced relocations and residential schools have led to educational inequalities and intergenerational trauma. It is essential to be aware of these problems in order to promote fair chances and reinstate programs that put Indigenous children's cultural identity and well-being first. How do we engage in it? Respect Indigenous rights. Advocate the upholding and implementation of treaty rights. Make sure that the commitments made in past treaties are honored and recognized by the state. Acknowledge and defend the spiritual and cultural rights of Indigenous people, especially the freedom to engage in traditional rituals, utilize sacred places, and conserve cultural assets. Support equitable resource revenue sharing arrangements that guarantee the economic gains of Indigenous groups from the exploitation of natural resources on their territories. Build meaningful relationships. Encourage and support Indigenous leaders while recognizing their knowledge and viewpoints during the decision-making process. Recognize and honor the customs and practices of the various Indigenous people you interact with, including the appropriate methods for cooperation and communication. Actively hear the worries, hopes, and viewpoints of Indigenous people and communities. Acknowledge and understand history. Inform yourself and other people on the effects of residential schools, the history of colonization, and effects on Indigenous peoples. Examine resources such as the final reports of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission and outcomes of the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. People can get a better grasp of the struggles that Indigenous communities deal with by actively searching out information about this past. To promote empathy, destroy preconceptions, and support projects that aid in decolonization efforts, it is essential to have this awareness. Promote inclusivity and cultural sensitivity. Ensure all educational programs, establishments, and policies are inclusive of and represent the perspective of Indigenous people. By recognizing their territories, Indigenous peoples can show their appreciation and acknowledgement. This approach highlights the ongoing and historical link that exists between Indigenous groups and their territories. Examples of decolonization. Restoring Indigenous peoples' land and resources while upholding their fundamental liberties and claim to their ancestral lands. embracing the diversity of richness of Indigenous language, culture, customs, and belief systems, and assisting in the revitalization and preservation. Putting into practice the TRC recommendations and which seek to heal and reconcile Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, as well as confront the repercussions of the Indian residential school system. Promoting nation-to-nation interactions built on the respect and collaboration, as well as Indigenous self-determination and autonomy. And addressing the institutionalized racism and prejudice that Indigenous people have experienced in a range of areas and settings, including the media, criminal system, healthcare, and education. Exploring decolonization and what Indigenous scholars had to say about it. We cannot decolonize without recognizing the primacy of land and Indigenous sovereignty over that land. Lawrence and Dua, 2005, poignantly remind us of this when they state, "To speak of Indigenous nationhood is to speak of land as Indigenous in ways that are neither rhetorical or metaphorical." Chickadee Richard, an Anishinaabe elder, depicted decolonization as going back to the ceremonies, knowing where you came from, our history, and how it has shaped us. She also spoke about how colonization has resulted in a lack of self-governance for Indigenous peoples and how decolonization is the road back.
Our personal reflection. At first, what we knew about decolonization is that the goal is to achieve Indigenous sovereignty. It often involves reclaiming Indigenous knowledge, languages, and traditions, and promoting equity and justice for marginalized communities. Our basic knowledge is that it requires individuals to confront uncomfortable truths about the legacy of colonialism, including its devastating impact on Indigenous peoples, cultures, and ecosystems. For example, the ban of fire burns caused wildfires to spread on both coasts. It continues to be an ongoing and an evolving process that requires collaboration and solidarity between Indigenous peoples, governments, institutions, and society, as we acknowledge and dismantle the system of colonial oppression, but rather working towards restoring Indigenous rights. In conclusion, decolonization represents a profound journey of self-discovery, accountability, and collective liberation. It challenges everyone to confront the legacies of colonialism embedded within our societies and work towards building a future that honors diversity, equality, and human dignity. Implications on early learning and childcare education. By incorporating more inclusive practices, embracing diverse learning styles, educators can foster greater engagement and enhance learning outcomes. Embracing Indigenous knowledge, languages, and practices in early childhood education can enhance cultural awareness, equity, and social justice. This requires reevaluating curriculum structures, educator training initiatives, and educational resources to incorporate a broad spectrum of experiences and histories. Decolonization efforts within early childhood education is a way for empowering marginalized communities, fostering comprehensive development, and establishing an educational environment that promotes equality for all children. Overall, collaboration is essential within families by better serving diverse needs of young children, laying a strong foundation for their lifelong learning journey. Calls to action based on early learning and childcare. 12. We call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to develop culturally appropriate early childhood education programs for Aboriginal families. Number 63. We call upon the Council of Ministers of Education, Canada, to maintain an annual commitment to Aboriginal education issues, developing and implementing kindergarten to grade 12 curriculum and learning resources on Aboriginal peoples in Canada history and the history and legacy of residential schools, sharing information and best practices on teaching curriculum related to residential schools and Aboriginal history, building student capacity for cultural understanding, empathy, and mutual respect. With a deeper appreciation of what all educators can learn from Indigenous cultures, we will be able to produce richer early childhood environments for children and stronger relationships with their families.